Welcome back. You're watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. Next, we turn to the ever-shifting sands of power in the Middle East. Russia may doubt the alleged killing of the ISIL leader claimed by the U.S. administration, but all can agree that Syria is far from elusive peace. Since the surprise U.S. pullout, the Syrian army has sent thousands of soldiers to its northern border to help Kurdish militia resist a Turkish offensive. Meanwhile, the area is also patrolled by joint Russian and Turkish forces. It was a deal welcomed by Iran, as complicated as it sounds. As Russia forces arrived in Syria, Washington said it was sending reinforcement to eastern Syria once again to prevent ISIL from seizing Syrian oil fields. That's at least claimed by Washington. So how will it all play out? Where is Russia in the map? Let's ask our panelists. And we're now joined in our studio in Beijing, Dmitry Trenin, who is the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, who has been with the center since its inception, and Alexander Gabuev, senior fellow and the chair of the Russia in the Asia Pacific program at the Carnegie Moscow Center. Welcome to two of you.
Great to be with you. Thank
you. It's almost like an annual gather together with the two of you.
Indeed.
We're delighted to be back.
So, Mr. Gabuev, exactly how the role of Russia do you think, with the recent change in geopolitics, for example, has been making Russia to the center stage of the world?
I think Russia is very unique in utilizing its limited resources and punching above its weight to make its voice heard and put its flag on global stage.
Why would you say that?
I think Russia used to be the size of Guangdong in terms of GDP 3 years back.
Guangdong province, which
now,
is one of the southern provinces in China.
Now it's getting smaller. It's closer to Shandong province, but still it has a very sizable appetite for using its military and go into really tough places like the Middle East and win wars there, like the war in Syria. That's very unique.
And I guess that is really the expertise of Mr. Trenin here. How has Moscow been able to leverage its power and capacity now in the Middle East with the U.S. trying to, quote-unquote, withdraw from the region? Now we do not know whether it's just one administration or a long time goal of the U.S. administrations, but from you, Mr. Trenin.
Well, first of all, I would like to say that the GDP is just one measuring stick to measure any country's weight in the world. So people would be ill-served by looking simply at the GDP comparisons. Russia is more than any province of China. And it has an important role to play, I think, using its clearly limited resources, but using them in a fairly strategic way in a few places like the Middle East. The Middle East is actually the gateway for Russia rolling out its newly regained status as a great power. There are very few countries that can perform the way Russia has performed in the Middle East. It's not just throwing your weight around. It's not just showing your military capacity, although it's partly that.
Yeah.
The more important thing is the ability to combine military power and diplomatic expertise to get some imperfect solutions to insoluble problems.
Russia, according to media reports at least, have been starting some kinds of military actions against the so-called rebels in the region, or the oppositions in the region. But how is Russia trying to play that balance card? In a way,
I think you answered yourself. You answered your own question, basically. you used the word.
That's the worst question that a journalist would ask.
Come on. You don't know. You don't know what I'm going to say.
Go ahead.
You don't know what the actual answer was. The answer was contained in your word balance. Now, Russia has managed to achieve something tangible in Syria because it learned the game of balance. You have to balance various forces. You never align yourself, you never wed yourself fully 100% to any of the players. And you never make any of the players your permanent enemy. What happened when the United States decided to pull out its forces from Syria was, some people say it's a gift to Russia. Trump, in his normal manner, his usual manner, is giving Mr. Putin another gift, right?
Do you think so?
In reality, what happened was Russia was given a poison chalice. Russia was risking a clash between its two allies. One ally sitting in Damascus, Mr. Assad and his forces, and the other ally sitting in Ankara, President Erdogan. And those forces started moving to meet each other somewhere in the border area. And then it took Mr. Putin and the Russian diplomats and the Russian military a lot of effort to actually manage three forces: the Syrians, the Turks, and the Kurds. And this was an achievement, but an achievement achieved in a critical situation. So this has put the Russian position at a higher level in Syria.
Let me continue to ask that a bit, also about the region in the Middle East. As we all know, it's an oil-rich region. That's why it is so turbulent over the years throughout history. But Russia also has an advantage now in the oil industry. So it's very interesting to see how its geopolitical and strategic goals intertwined with this complexity of its economic advantage.
Exactly. One of the things that we talked about, the Syria intervention and how much prestige it brought to Russia, how many more arms contracts it brought to Russia, and other things. But what Russia's involvement in the Middle East has also resulted in a totally new relationship, a cooperative relationship with the oil-rich country Saudi Arabia, the country that sits atop of the world's largest resources, some of the largest resources of oil in the world. And Russia has been able, through, again, very careful economic diplomacy this time, to arrange with Saudi Arabia a scheme, a formula that has allowed Russia and Saudi and the rest of the OPEC plus other countries to keep the oil price reasonably high and stable. And this is an even bigger contribution to Russia's current situation than arms contracts, for example. The oil price is very, very important. And that is thanks to this link between Moscow and Riyadh that has been there for some time and continues to be there.
And that's why the United States come into being, I mean, in a way, because the shale gas has been the U.S.'s future, in a way. And that is one of the most important reasons as to why the U.S. at the moment is not that interested in the Middle East anymore, as many believe. So, Mr. Gabuev, what about the future? Will Russia, in a way, form some kinds of economic, stronger interaction with the region in the Middle East vis-a-vis the U.S. interest? What is likely to be the general picture as we see so many moving factors?
I think that Russia is not seeking to be the ultimate security guarantor in the region and put its forces permanently somewhere beyond Syria.
It will be too much pressure for Moscow.
But it definitely wants to use the leverage that it's now created to continue this beneficial relationship with Saudi Arabia and to coordinate the oil prices jointly. And I think that's the task which is very much inside, and that's very achievable.
It's a new era of China-Russia relations. After 70 years of diplomatic ties, the two neighbors agreed to keep expanding cooperation. Bilateral trade is on the rise, which now exceeds $100 billion. The militaries of China and Russia have worked on strengthening mutual abilities through joint exercises. Face-to-face meetings of leaders from Beijing and Moscow show how tightly knit they are. Amid global uncertainty, China and Russia hope to set their partnership as an example for major power relations.
Asia Pacific, for example, which is your expertise, Mr. Gabuev, we see Russia very active with China, forming partnerships, for example, at SCO, at BRICS, and also on the bilateral interactions very frequently, for example, the Chinese president and the Russian president. So how do you see this economic and trade links between these two countries and their roles on the multilateral platform, paving the way for some kinds of evolving of relationship between the two?
If we look structurally, Russia and China are just mutual fits. Russia has abundance of natural resources, lacks investment, needs infrastructure, and needs technology. China is the opposite. Huge surplus of capital, huge market for commodities that Russia can provide. China right now is just 18% of Russia's total trade. Used to be 10% just 6 years ago. So it's growing along the trade
with
volume.
Political will
With
to
political
come first,
will,
and then there's economic
but it's also
catch
Russia
up.
waking up to the size and opportunities provided by the Chinese market. An increasing number of firms want to tap in, and here the trade war comes in. As long as there is no trade deal between the US and China, and as long as China doesn't need to purchase large volumes of American oil, as is envisaged in the phase 1 of the deal, Russia has a lot of space to really come in the market. I think that Chinese market for hydrocarbons will grow, so it's a place for everybody, but Russia is really strategic in tapping into those new opportunities.
Very interesting. You see both on a general picture, and also you see also that reflected in certain examples. Mr. Trenning, for example, agricultural products. Russia could provide some kinds of alternative to the Chinese market compared to what the U.S. could provide, agricultural products, for example. And we've seen that over the past few months when the trade war, quote unquote, going on between China and the United States. Meanwhile, on a general picture, when China and the United States, the latter calling China as the strategic rival, once again, if you look at the Pence's recent speech about China-U.S. relations, is certainly an interesting player in this sense, Mr. Trenning.
Well, first of all, I would say that the Vice President's speech, the U.S. Vice President's speech this year, looked a little bit more conciliatory.
Compared to last year's, yes,
compared to last year's, probably for domestic political reasons in the United States. I think the big change that I experienced since my visit to Beijing a year ago was the deterioration, market deterioration of Sino-American relations. And I think we need to realize, if we haven't already, that China and the United States are in a systemic rivalry. It's not political, it's not because of this election, because of this man, but it's a competition between the two mightiest economies in the world. And that's very, very, very important. It will last some time, etc.
Is that the Russian view?
It's
on a strategic rivalry.
It's an analyst's view. I think that, you know, various people in the United States would share that view. We discussed it among ourselves, and many of my American colleagues would agree with the rivalry becoming systemic, and that's a wholly new ball game. Maybe it's not a ball game anymore. It's maybe some other kind of game, but something fundamental has changed in the last 2 years in Sino-American relations.
So how is Russia, Moscow, you know, looking at the picture, maybe in the way that you do, but or maybe in a different lens, looking at this role?
Mr. Putin, when he was asked that question at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum,
that's right,
earlier this year, he said, well, we're like, you know, this proverbial monkey that looks down on, you know, the tigers in the valley. I'm not sure it's a very apt description, frankly. Russia is in a different position. I would say this.
What is the different position you're talking about?
The different position is this. Russia has relations with China and the United States which are starkly different. The relationship with China is very close. It's officially called strategic partnership, and then they add so many other words to that. The relationship with the United States is confrontation.
You better catch up, Mr. Trenning. There are a lot of adjectives going on right here.
Well,
from time to time changing.
I'm not in that business. My job does not depend on whether I remember all those words or not.
Right. Go ahead.
So I think that for Russia, the important thing is to manage the relationship, the very unequal relationships and very, let's say, asymmetrical rather than unequal relationships with the two superpowers of this world in a way that would preserve Russia's own equilibrium. For Russia, the most important thing is not equality. Equality cannot be achieved either with China or with the United States.
Yeah.
What can be achieved, though, is equilibrium. You stand on your own feet. You do not tilt this way, that way. You do not become over-dependent on this country or that country.
Yeah.
You do not bandwagon on Washington or Beijing.
Okay.
You're Moscow. You're your own man. You're Russia. Or woman, for that matter.
Okay, all right then. I got the analogy
Okay,
anyway.
good.
But Mr. Gabuev, I mean, if you look at what is going on between Moscow and Washington, it's not that pleasant. I mean, Russia, quote unquote, the name itself seems to be political toxic, as you may know, on Capitol Hill at least, in the United States. So, and the investigation about Russia-related issues now already become a so-called criminal investigation. You see the degree of it. So, Mr. Gabuev, no matter how much Russia wants to be, quote unquote, taking advantage or taking a strategically important position in this regard, it is not going to be regarded as neutral by Washington. So how would you see that role that Russia has to bear in mind?
I think that
it's very interesting.
I think that sources of Russia-U.S. confrontation are much deeper than just Russian interference in the U.S. election or Trump. Or
being accused, by the way.
Or the whole political earthquake and the toxic cloud around Russia and accusations.
So how complicated is it? So there was a history of the Cold War,
there is
of course.
History and there is power balance and a question of Russia's place in the world, and the U.S. accepts of Russia playing a special, not an equal, but a special place in the world and its own neighborhood in particular. Russia as a sovereign player which doesn't really subscribe to U.S. unilateral vision. So that's at the crux of the issue. And then when it comes to Russia's relationship with China, I think that we share so many interests like security of the common border and this economic relationship and some similarities in our political systems that it's just very impossible for me to imagine that Russia will just abandon its partnership with China in order to improve relationship with the West. It doesn't mean that Russia will maintain its confrontation forever. And I think that Europe and other players in Asia have also an important role in this Russia's attempt to balance its relationship with China that is increasingly asymmetrical. So they also have an agency and they also have an interest to bring Russia into equilibrium.
Interesting. Well, things are evolving so fast. I hope our conversation can really stand at least 24 hours. That's, of course, it's just a joke.
We'll be back in a year.
Yeah, well, there we go, yes.
And then we learn all the adjectives needed, at least the new era will be with us.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Gabuev and Mr. Trenning. Always a pleasure to see both of you in Beijing for your interaction with the Chinese community as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We love to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.